Yes.
Good evening, one and all. On behalf of Rajkot Ophthalmic Society, I would like to welcome you all in this first Rajkot Ophthalmic Society case files. And along with that, we will felicitate our senior ophthalmologist in each and every case file day. With this, I would like to hand over mic to Dr. Mukesh Porwal, sir. He will brief about today's schedule. Over to you, sir.
Welcome to everyone in Rajkot Ophthalmic Society. We have started a new venture of case files. I hope that more and more people turn up with good cases. It will be a small meeting, but hopefully it will be well worth everybody's time. So we have put up 4 cases today. The first one will be Dr. Mihir Vaidya from PDO Medical College. Interesting case. So I request Mihir to unmute, share his screen, and also start his presentation after introducing himself.
Once a minute, sir. Everyone else should mute themselves so we can
avoid
hear properly the speaker. Yeah.
Is my screen visible, sir?
Yes.
Okay. Hello and good evening to one and all. I am Dr. Mihir Vaidya and I am a final year resident in GT Shet Eye Hospital, Civil Hospital, Rajkot. First of all, I would like to thank ROS for giving me an opportunity to speak on this platform. I would also like to thank Dr. Vimal Vyas, sir, my guide and head of our department. He's a gem of a person and a gem of a teacher and has always inspired and motivated all of us to excel academically and surgically. So today I'll be presenting a case of ocular siderosis, and a 30-year-old male presented to the OPD with chief complaints of gradual painless diminution of vision since the last 4 months. He gave a past history of accidental trauma to his right eye with some metallic foreign body, and he had consulted a local doctor who gave him some eye drops. The pain was relieved and then he did not consult further. So on examination in our OPD, the right eye had a vision of hand movements, perception of light positive with normal projection of place in the left eye. It was 6/9. The intraocular pressures in both eyes were normal. So this is how we presented to us. This is a slit lamp photograph. What you can see here is a mature cataract, and this is a pharmacologically dilated pupil for examination. Otherwise, the pupils were RRR, and you can also see some brownish pigmentation on the anterior capsule. The anterior segment examination also revealed a macular opacity at the superior limbus. On gonioscopy, in both eyes, the angles were open and no evidence of any metallic foreign body was seen. The pupillary reactions were normal in both eyes and there was no RAPD. Anterior chamber looked quiet. There was no inflammation in the form of aqueous cells or flare. We did the B-scan ultrasonography, X-ray orbit and CT orbit for this patient, which too were normal. There was no evidence of intraocular foreign body seen, retinal or choroidal detachment or vitreous hemorrhage. This is the X-ray orbit in the lateral and anterior posterior view. This is the right eye B-scan for this patient and CT scan of the orbit. It shows no abnormality, and this we are doing to look at any intraocular foreign body which can be lodged in the eye. So the patient was managed by a small incision cataract surgery, and a sample of the cataractus lens with its anterior lens capsule was obtained per op and sent for a histopathological examination. The surgery was uneventful except for some difficulty in doing the continuous curvilinear capsular access, and that was because of some fibrosis which was induced by the pigmentation. Post-operatively, the fundus examination was done and retina and vitreous appeared normal. Unaided visual acuity was 618 on the first post-op day, which improved to 612 on the 10th post-op, and with the best corrected visual acuity with a refraction was 6/6 on after 1 month. Dilated fundus examination was done with direct, binocular indirect, and a slit lamp 90D examination on 2 subsequent follow-ups 1 month apart to look for any intraocular foreign body which could have been missed or for any posterior segment changes in the form of pigmentation, but none were found. The histopathological examination was done with two stains. First was H&E, and the second was a special stain, that is Pearl's Prussian blue. Scattered hemosiderin deposits were seen with H&E, and Prussian blue was confirmatory for iron. This is the image. On the left is the slit lamp image, which we already saw. And on the right, this is the HPE examination. What you can see here are some macrophages which have engulfed hemosiderin. And also there is some iron in the extracellular matrix. So now let's move on to the discussion of this case. What is ocular siderosis? It is a condition of the eye which is caused by deposition of iron in the tissues. The cause which is most commonly encountered is an iron-containing foreign body which has been lodged because of trauma. The patient may present with different varieties. It can show cataract formation, subluxation of the lens due to trauma. Deposition of iron pigments can be in different parts of the eye, that is the lens epithelium as we saw in our case, on the anterior lens capsule, corneal endothelium, and the iridocorneal angle. So here we can see a picture which shows iron deposition on the anterior capsule. There are some posterior synechiae which are formed at 7 o'clock, and those might be because of an uveitis which was associated. Now the eye is quiet, but there are some posterior synechiae. On the right side, we can see a gonioscopic picture, and that also shows some pigment deposition in the angle. So what can happen is there can be some trabeculitis associated with this, and it can also cause open angle glaucoma. Let's move ahead. When suspecting ocular siderosis, it is very, very important to detect and localize an intraocular foreign body. Some clues can be there for potential entry points in the form of scars on the cornea or near the limbus, iris holes if the foreign body has gone behind, or sphincter tears due to trauma. The foreign body can be hidden. It can be hidden in the iridocorneal angle. It can be also hidden behind the peripheral corneal opacity or the arcus senilis, and thus a gonioscopy is a must before you dilate the patient. Pigment dispersion and deposition on various structures can occur. Endothelium and trabecular meshwork are some of those, and a siderotic cataract can be there. With the pigment deposition in trabecular meshwork, there can be some associated trabeculitis, anterior uveitis, which can lead to a secondary open angle glaucoma. And if the inflammation increases and synechiae form, then it can also present as a closed angle glaucoma. Fundus, that is a posterior segment, can also be affected in these cases. And initially, there is some peripheral pigmentation due to the dispersion of iron. And other presentations can be uveitis, posterior synechiae, zonular weakness, lens subluxation, pupillary mydriasis, and RAPD can occur if the retina is functionally involved. Here we can see an image of siderotic uveitis and associated glaucoma. As we can see, there is some corneal haze, which is secondary to raised intraocular pressure. There is inflammation in the anterior chamber, which is settled in the form of few exudates inferiorly. The posterior segment changes are retinal pigmentation, which can start as early as 2 weeks and can occur even later in life, that is after 8 to 10 years. In some cases, there can be a retinal hole or a detachment. It can be an exudative detachment due to inflammation of the posterior retina, and it can also be a traumatic detachment due to a regma, that is a retinal hole. In such cases, you can see RAPD. There's no patient. So this is a picture of retinal hyperpigmentation. In the first picture, you can see a peripheral pigmentation, and in the second picture, you can clearly see that the macula is also involved. This is due to prolonged toxicity by an iron-containing foreign body. Imaging, as we saw, can be conducted by ultrasound biomicroscopy, UBM, a B scan, X-ray orbit, and CT scan. This is to detect an intraocular foreign body and also to visualize the posterior segment in cases the view is obscured, like in our case with a mature cataract. An ophthalmic endoscopy can also be done, and it can help us visualize the ciliary body and the structures of the pars plana, but it is usually not done due to its invasive nature. What is very important in the case of ocular siderosis is an ERG, that is an electroretinogram. In cases of early ocular siderosis, there can be a supernormal response, but what is more commonly seen is a diminished response with a decreased amplitude of A and B waves.
Just a minute, Mihir.
Yes,
In
sir.
your case, what was done, and any other investigation of these electrophysiology or anything was done?
No, sir. In my case, we could not conduct an ERG because the patient was not affordable. We had suggested him that we do an ERG and we could have referred him to a higher center for that. But due to the technological unavailability of ERG and his unaffordability, we could not do it.
Right. And what is the longest follow-up you have?
The longest follow-up I have is of 5 months.
5 months. Okay. You can quickly summarize the rest of the presentation and then we can discuss a bit.
Yes, sir. This is an ERG in ocular siderosis. We can see the comparison in the normal eye and the abnormal eye, where in left eye the A and B waves are decreased. HP can be done with HNE stains and also with a pulse Prussian blue stain. Immunohistochemistry also has a role. That is CD18, which is a classic macrophage marker, might be found. So what is the take-home message of treating a patient with ocular siderosis? We have to look for a foreign body always. It can be hidden in various places, but the foreign body may not always been found because there are many cases which are reported in which the foreign body has been disintegrated and not always found. The extent of investigations depends on multiple factors like patient affordability, severity of siderosis, and limitations of the setup. However, a meticulous examination and regular follow-up should be always done to rule out any long-term retinotoxicity. A 6-monthly ERG is advised for the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Mihir. Very good case, especially the slit lamp photograph of that siderotic cataract with the brownish pigments deposited on the lens. Very classic. Okay. When the foreign body was not found, what special steps were taken to try to find a hidden foreign body?
So for hidden foreign body, we did a gonioscopy and we did all the imaging modalities. We dilated the pupil and saw if anything is there in the lens. And per op also when we tried to wash, there was no foreign body or anything. It was found.
But the clinical examination, see, did you do a good indentation, indirect ophthalmoscopy of the peripheral fundus inferiorly? That is important. Most of the foreign body is lodged in the pars plana area in the inferior part. And they can be covered with some debris or hemorrhage or sometimes exudate, and you may miss it. So repeated indirect ophthalmoscopy with indentation, especially inferior part, would sometimes lead to discovery of a small foreign body.
Yes, sir. We had done it post-op. Post-op after 2 months, we had done a binocular direct with a indentation ophthalmoscopy, indentation biomicroscopy, but we could not see or localize the exact foreign body site.
And in the 5-month follow-up, the vision was good. It was 6.6 as you as it was there before.
Yes, sir. It was 6.6 and the retina was also normal. There was no posterior pigmentation or peripheral pigmentation.
Because that is surprising. Because once you have a siderosis on the lens, you expect some siderosis in the retina and the vision to be compromised to some extent, if not immediately, at least in the long term.
Yes.
Right. And did you instruct the CT scan radiologist to look for a foreign body in the inferior part with a closer cuts than normal?
Okay, sir. Sir, we while sending the investigations, we wrote that X-ray orbit and CT scan of orbit to localize any retained intraocular foreign body. A closer cuts that specifically wasn't mentioned.
Yeah, because once it comes negative, the next thing we have to tell them is ask them to review their CT scans which are there in their computer, or do it again with closer spacing.
Yes.
Normally they do it, I think 1 millimeter, 1.5 millimeters. You might have to ask them to scan it closer, especially in the inferior peripheral retina in the pars plana area.
Definitely, so we can do it on the follow-up of that patient.
And histopathology, you were talking about histopathology, but what tissue would you take for histopathology?
Sir, we sent the entire lens for histopathology. We had done an SICS. So we had the entire lens and we also had the capsulorhexis, which was done curvilinear. We sent the capsule separately and the lens separately. which led us to the finding of the deposition of pigment in the anterior capsule as well as the anterior lens epithelium.
Right, good. I would invite comments from other members in the audience. Dr. Dhruv, Dr. Gadre,
Good evening, sir.
good evening.
Sir, I had just two quick questions. Were both eyes involved or only one of the eyes was involved?
Only one eye was
Only
involved.
one eye, of course.
Acha. And
Can you stop sharing?
Yes, sir.
Here?
Yes, sir.
what is the treatment like current? How many patients you have? Sorry, I joined late actually. This was one patient?
Yes, sir. This was a case report involving only one
Okay.
patient.
So my question was, are you giving any chelation therapy or anything to the patient?
At present, the patient is not showing evidence of foreign body or any symptoms after the cataract extraction. So we have not started any specific therapy, but we intend on following up the patient 1 monthly or like 2 monthly for some days and monitoring.
So normally, as Dr. Mukesh sir said, that once the ocular sidrosis sets in, normally a progressive disease, as I understand, as I remember correctly, I think we should, or rather you should do a ERG, and if you can, I mean, if you want to get a ERG done, you can send them here. We can do it. I mean, we can do it free of cost for him, because it would be very important to know what would be the electroretinogram findings.
Yes,
And if one of the eyes is involved, there is a chance that other eye may get involved. I don't know. I would like to get the senior guys comment on whether how much is the chance of other eye getting involved.
As far as sidrosis is concerned, I would think that it is entirely related to the foreign body inside that eye. This is not a systemic sidrosis. It is a focal foreign body related
But
sidrosis.
there is no foreign body, no? There is no foreign body.
Yeah, but that is not found. That is the thing. It is, as he said, sometimes it's a very small foreign body which went in long back and it's got disintegrated, too small to be picked up. Because even ultrasound or CT scans have their limitations. They cannot pick up everything. So I think bilateral sidrosis would be rare, and only if there is a bilateral foreign body.
She said for me it's essential.
At this point, I would especially welcome Dr. Jitendra Jethani, who graciously agreed to be present for this meeting, especially for our next case coming up from
It's the first
Dr.
face-to-face.
Pooja Lakhani
It's a blind date.
on muscle transplantation.
Hang on.
Can I request all the
And like
audience
as it
keep their
talks maybe
mics
you know, when-
muted, because
Like,
I'm getting some background noise from some name Parina Parekh.
she sees
Parekh.
she will
Can you please mute? Yeah. Otherwise, I'll have to mute from here, but then I have to selectively unmute whoever is speaking. So whoever is not speaking, please mute their microphones. Nice case, Mihir.
Thank you, sir.
We'd like to have a follow-up of that. And as Dr. Jethani suggested, if you need electrophysiology, you can send it to him, and it will be taken care of.
Definitely, sir. Thanks a lot, sir.
Right. Suketu, please announce the next case, please.
Our next case is presented by Dr. Pooja Lakhani. She is practicing pediatric ophthalmology since I think 2 to 3 years, and she is doing very well. So we are going to hear from her. And I kindly request all of us to please mute. It is very much disturbing. I'm not hearing clearly. Sir, you can mute all, and
Yeah.
whoever wants to speak, they can unmute.
Yeah. I think there was, I think now it's okay. We've done.
Yeah, sir. Fine. So our next case is presented by Dr. Pooja Lakhani. She is practicing in private as a pediatric ophthalmologist, and she is doing very well clinically. So we are going to hear from her soon. Over to you, Pooja.
Thank you, Suketu Bhai. Good evening, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank ROS for giving me this opportunity. I think it's a very good idea to mix and match so that
Just a minute. I will unmute you. Pooja, you can unmute yourself
Yes, sir.
because I muted all.
Yes, sir. Am I audible? Clear?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, thank you, sir. So I'll be presenting today on a case of true muscle transplantation for large angle strabismus. Just a second. Yeah. A 23-year-old male presented to me with complaint of squinting of right eye since birth. He had a history of consulting an ophthalmologist just few days back and was referred to me for further management. There was no significant systemic history. On examination, I could see that the visual acuity in both eye was 6/6 part without glasses for distance and N6 for near. There was no significant refractive error, which was confirmed by cycloplegic refraction. Both eye anterior segment and fundus examination was within normal limit. On ocular motility examination, I could see that Hirschberg reflex test showed right eye exotropia, that is divergent squint of 45°. On cover-uncover test, there was alternate exotropia with left eye dominance grade 3. Sorry, that's a typing mistake. Ocular movements were full. Prism bar cover test showed 110 prism diopters of exotropia for distance as well as near. And it was comitant in all cases. So my diagnosis was large angle exotropia with left eye dominance. So now, I had 3 treatment options. First is for such a large angle exotropia, we can go for either right eye conventional recess resect procedure and followed by left eye surgery, because with single eye we can cover hardly 55 to 60 prism diopter of squint. Or second option was right eye large amount of recess resect beyond the conventional limits with or without hemi-hangback procedure. And third was true muscle transplantation. I opted for right eye true muscle transplantation because the patient wanted uniocular surgery only, and large amount of recess resect has disadvantages of movement restrictions. So right eye lateral rectus recession was done 10 millimeter plus 6, that is total of 16 mm, using stump of medial rectus, that is total 16, and medial rectus resection of 6 millimeter was done conventionally. I would like to share the video in between before proceeding. I'll stop sharing this and share my video. Video is visible? Hello?
No, it's not visible.
I guess it should be visible now.
Yes, now visible.
Now, in this was the right eye of the patient. So first I isolated the lateral rectus muscle, and the sutures were taken using 60 Prolene suture, that is non-absorbable. Conventionally we use Vicryl, that is absorbable suture, but here to join the stump I have taken Prolene suture. Now instead of cutting it, I have just kept it aside. Then I have isolated the medial rectus muscle, and then I have taken the sutures. One is 6 millimeter behind the insertion and one is just immediately near the insertion. In conventional resections, what we do is we remove this stump of the muscle and just join this near the insertion. But here, after cutting this from 6 millimeter behind the original insertion, I'll preserve this stump. It is very important to preserve the sheath of the muscle and try to maintain as tissue respect as far as possible. After cutting this muscle stump, I'll make sure that the side is not inverted, preserve the stump aside, and complete this resection in a conventional manner. This is the medial rectus stump of 6 millimeter. Generally, we used to just dispose it in conventional surgeries, but here I'll preserve it. So I've taken sutures to make my task easier. And then I have sutured that here, completing the conventional resection of medial rectus. After that, I have again secured the lateral rectus. Here you can see the blue color Prolene suture. After cauterizing properly, I'll cut the lateral rectus from its insertion. And after that, I'll join the stump over here. We make sure the side is not inverted, the tissue is not crumpled to get better results. Just forward. After the stump is sutured to the lateral rectus, and just forward it a bit. This you can see the stump of the muscle here. This one is the stump and this is the lateral rectus. We'll make sure that we clear all the adhesions. This is the sutured stump. And then we'll insert a 10 millimeter behind the original insertion of lateral rectus. So we get total of 10 plus 6, 16 millimeter of recession of lateral rectus. And after that, conventional closure was done.
Pooja, you can be slightly louder.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. So I'll again share my screen. So this was the surgery done, and then on the postoperative day, day 1, there was no deviation for near, but there was slight right eye exotropia of 10 degree for distance, and even on alternate cover test, there was 10 degree of exotropia. Right eye abduction restricted was there, that is -2, 50% of abduction restriction was there. On day 30, that is on 1 month follow-up, for near, there was no deviation on corneal reflex test, but for distance, there was 5 degree of exotropia. And on cover test, we can see alternate exotropia of 7 degree, and prism on prism bar cover test, there was 14 prism diopters of exotropia. Right eye abduction restriction, which was -2 on the day for 1, became -1 on after 1 month. We'll also see the pictures, and then I had follow-up of patient after a year or 2. After 6 months, we can see everything was same, just that there was slight reduction in prism bar cover test. Instead of 14, we had 10 prism diopter of exotropia, but the abduction restriction was -1, that is 75% movement was still there. And after 12 months of follow-up, it was the same. We can see the pictures. This is a pre-op picture, 110 prism diopters of exotropia on day 1 and on day 30. This is a 9 gaze picture. Taken on 1 year follow-up, primary gaze, no exotropia. This is something I want to highlight. In right gaze, there is slight restriction of abduction, but patient doesn't have any clinical problem at present. So my conclusion was, in large angle strabismus, true muscle transplantation is a safe alternate option when uniocular surgery is desired. The surgical results are stable in long term and therefore is a viable option. It is superior to the option of conventional recess resect in a way that large angle can be covered with one eye surgery only. It is also better than large angle recess resect or hemi-hangback procedure because in those procedures there are prominent movement restrictions and often palpable fissure changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Pooja. That was excellent. The case, the presentation, and the video, all of it.
Thank you.
I now invite Dr. Jitendra Jethani to give his expert comments and discuss about this case a bit further.
Just I would like to say something before he says.
Sure.
Jethani sir has done a lot of work in transplantation, and he is the first one to do a study of 22 patients of esotropia. All done, true muscle transplantation was done, and definitely is a motivation for so many surgeons to try new techniques. Yes, sir. Please.
That's why we have him here, and it's nice of him to be here. Thank you again.
Pleasure, sir. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and it was a wonderful case. I mean, excellent surgery, excellent post-op result. It basically reconvinces us that a lot of people do say that. Yeah. Dr. Mukesh is saying you have to stop sharing, Pooja.
Sorry, sir. Okay.
So it is I think the case reinforces our belief that there is always something new out there, and in strabismus also there are a lot of new things which come up. Pertaining to the case, I would say that as Dr. Pooja said, that it is a wonderful addition to our, especially for patients who want uniocular surgery, especially for amblyopic patients where there is very large angle and we we are bound to operate only one of the eyes. There are now, at least there are 2 articles in Strabismus and in JPOS, which I have recently reviewed, where they have discussed the results of large angle exotropia and true muscle transplantation. My own experience has been very good, and that is why I have tried it out in large hypotropia also. I had presented that at a couple of places, and it is under review in IGO. Right now, very large angle, especially those thyroid cases. So the pathophysiology, or rather the reason how it works, is that it elongates the total muscle, and that is how it weakens it further. But the most important thing here is that it does not change the ocular motility pattern. So that is what Pooja wanted to highlight, that if you do such a large recession, like 10 millimeter plus 6 millimeter, so it is around 16 millimeter of recession, the abduction would be almost completely restricted. You won't see that there is an abduction available, because you are well beyond the physiological equator. Even anatomical equator, you will be behind anatomical equator. So the point which she has made is that you are well anterior to the equator, and yet you have elongated the muscle, and so you are actually giving a good result, keeping the insertion of the muscle anterior to the equator. So that is the reason how it works. So if there are any questions, I think myself and Dr. Pooja can take, if there are any questions on muscle transplantation.
So as far as
I've got one question.
yes, sir.
The muscle which is transplanted, does that muscle becomes fibrous, or does it remain as a muscle? That is number 1. Number 2, instead of suppose transplanting that muscle piece, can we put the silicone piece just like that, because it works as the mechanical, not at the muscular, it doesn't work as a muscle. So I would like to comment by Dr. Jathani or Dr. Pooja.
Yes, sir. Shall I, or you will?
Yeah, you go ahead.
Okay. The muscle tissue that is transplanted, it remains viable, but it loses its contractile properties. That was a study done on dogs primarily, and so is followed over here. It remains viable after transplantation. And the second, that if we use silicone bands or sutures or something that is successfully used in between tendons, like in superior oblique chicken suturing. But here the problem is when you use it near the insertion, there are very high chances of extrusions and the problems related to extrusion. Plus there are chances of allergy and reactions too. But when you transplant the own muscle tissue, so there are practically nil chances of reactions, and even the extrusion rates are not there. So it is safer than the artificial grafts. I mean.
Thank you, Pooja. Thank you, Pooja.
Thank you.
And how much extra correction can you get with the transplantation, which you otherwise won't get with the standard resection?
Yes. Generally, per eye, we get, if you don't want to restrict any movements, we get maximum of 60 prism diopters. And with transplant, I have been able to do up to 100 prism diopters of correction, 100 to 105.
On a single eye?
Yeah, on a single eye.
So single eye surgery?
Yes, single eye.
That's great.
And especially when we do it in esotropia cases, the adduction restriction is almost, non-identifiable. It is so virtually nil. In exotropia cases, there is slight abduction restriction, that is -1. But if we see practically those patients who have lived long with 110 prisms of, exotropia, they just don't mind slight abduction restriction if we give them a chance not to touch their other eye. So.
Right. And not doing the other eye, any specific reason?
Yeah, as
the patient's preference.
Amblyopic eye, sometimes they just don't want to touch, and sometimes we just want to, it's better to do it in a single process.
One by one. Okay.
Yeah.
Another important point in exotropia is that these patients, contrary to popular belief, exotropia, especially intermittent exotropes who go into constant exotropia, they do not have a problem, absolutely problem in the eyes. So basically the misalignment is because their brain has a tendency. See, what happens in intermittent exotropia is that in all of us, we all are normals, and our eye, before it drifts, whenever our in the human eyes, our eyes are never stand still. There are always microsaccades which are there. Now, before the eye there is a microsacchard which is being generated for the eye to go outward. The proprioceptive receptors of lateral rectus and medial rectus send a biofeedback to brain. This particular microsaccade which is going to initiate is cut in infancy, and so our eyes remain straight. In intermittent exotropes, this biofeedback is missing. So these patients are bound to go back into exotropia. There is almost a 23% chance that they will again go back to exotropia. So if she has operated one eye, and the patient, since the patient is a child, another 10, 12 years, he may again go, and so there is another eye which is there, which you can operate and still make it straight. So that is a very important thing, especially in exotropes. In esotropes, the problem is at a different level. So the chances of recurrence in esotropes are not much.
Right. And what about any need for resurgery with these transplantation techniques?
Sir, resurgeries, the problem is that the transplanted muscle would serve more as a muscle, just like in in retroequatorial myopexy. So what happens is that the muscle, the posterior end of the muscle, so there are two layers of the muscle. The global layer will not fuse, but the global layer will fuse with the sclera. So effectively, that particular structure is not, as Dr. Pooja said, that particular structure is not having contractile properties, but it is still maintaining the insertion which is anterior to the equator. So it is more like a band, but it is totally stuck to the sclera. So resurgeries, if we want to do, we have to go back to the actual muscle part. This whole would be like a stretch scar. It would be a scar tissue. It will be more of a fibrotic scar tissue. So this all would be more of a redundant thing which is attached to the actual muscle. So we'll have to find out the original muscle and do the resurgery, if at all we want to do it.
Right. Nice technique and nice discussion we have had. On that case, we'll have to move on to the third case. Dr. Suketu.
Yeah, nice case, Pooja, and nice surgery. Now, next case presenter will be Dr. Devyani Gadre. She is a dynamic corneal surgeon into the private practice working in Gadre Eye Care. So quickly we will move to Dr. Devyani. She will present her case.
Thank you for the opportunity. As I share my screen, I'd like to thank ROS for starting this excellent initiative. It's really nice to share our work with each other. So my topic for today, is my screen visible?
Yes, it is
Yeah,
perfect.
okay.
Yes, yes.
Only you need to be a bit louder.
Louder? Okay, yeah. So my topic for today is amniotic membrane grafting, and it is not the answer to all your problems, especially in ocular burns. And why I say that is the case will talk for itself. So the case in question is a 20-year-old man who presented to us 1.5 months after a blast injury and essentially a thermal injury. He had undergone amniotic membrane transplant elsewhere, and regular follow-ups are also undertaken there. When he presented to us, the picture was something like this. This is the scariest picture an ophthalmologist can get. It's the absence of a cornea. Only thing that was between me and the iris was, apart from the slit lamp, was a BCL. So what I could see in this patient was there was a total corneal melt. There was a large band of conjunctival granulomatous tissue. There was this BCL that was lying there with actually no job, and this sliver of a whitish tissue which could have been an infiltrate, could have not been an infiltrate. There was a history of being treated for fungal keratitis for this patient. So there were a lot of issues that were staring at our faces here. So always the question is what next, and that keeps us awake at night. This particular case, challenges were that there was a total melt of the cornea, there was a possible history of a secondary fungal keratitis, and there was a severe ocular surface inflammation which needed to be taken care of, and there was a total we didn't know where the limbus was and whether it was functional, not functional. So what was the source of epithelium in the event of a large globe saving surgery that we were planning. So our plan was a large diameter penetrating keratoplasty with microbiology backup for the sliver of infected or query infected tissue that was remaining there. The plan was to decrease the surface inflammation and enhance any chances of surface epithelialization, which is the primary goal of after any chemical injury in the acute phase. So the plan was to do penetrating keratoplasty with alloslet probably, with an amniotic membrane and tarsorrhaphy. So this is the post-op picture. I'm sorry, I don't have the surgical video, and it was quite bloody. So this is a post-op picture where we did the thing as planned. What we did was, instead of doing an alloslet, we went ahead and took a bit of an eccentric graft. By taking an eccentric graft, what we did was we got a superior rim of limbus from the graft itself. And so we did not have to harvest the limbus separately and attach it on the penetrating graft that we had taken. Anyway, it was a very large graft that we had to take. This picture is 1 month post-surgery. We can see that the few of the sutures are getting loose and there is vascularity creeping in from the superior limbus, which is a good thing in this case because we want that in any source of epithelium is good epithelium at this stage. The amniotic membrane is well integrated into the graft and the AC looks well formed, which was the main goal of our surgery. And we live to fight another day. Our future is, however, not very promising because we have a large graft in a young patient, which in itself is a challenging situation. Glaucoma is always lurking and cataract is not too far behind, especially in an eye which has been open for so long and multiple surgeries have been required. Even in the future, he will require multiple surgeries. We need to manage this patient's expectations also. My goal for having presented this case was not really in the surgery or in the management of the case, but in how do we not come to this situation? How do we ever not have to see a totally melted cornea? And basically, it's very important that we remain aggressive with these patients because chemical burns are a very dynamic situation that require a day-to-day assessment. We need to explain to the patient a requirement for multiple surgeries and they have to be done because we are trying to create an epithelial cover in these patients, especially in the severe grades. Judicious use of AMT. Sometimes there is this understanding that you do off an AMT for an ocular burn and everything will be okay. Really, that's not the case, especially in the severe cases. We have published literature which tells us that amniotic membrane transplants are of absolutely no use when there is no native source of epithelium to give us an epithelial cover. Sometimes grade 4, grade 5, grade 6 DUAs burns come with absolutely denuded conjunctival epithelium as well. And then those are the situations where we actually need to look for an allogenic source of epithelium. And that's how our grafts and all come into place. We may need a repetition of AMT as well. We need to keep on repeating. Amniotic membrane will essentially play the role of a biological bandage and at times, and that also is buying you time if you don't have tissue to do an alloslet. If nothing is possible and you are seeing a case where there is a lot of epithelial defect, not only on the cornea, but even in the conjunctiva, I suggest do off a total tarsorrhaphy and you are saving the eye. The patient may not feel so, but that is the truth. And avoid corneal perforation and melt at all costs, because once we reach this stage where we have to do a large graft in the acute stage of the injury, we really have no way of going back to how it was ever again. So basically, these were the points that I wanted to make. In conclusion, we need to grade these injuries at every visit, because what may seem as a grade 5 or 6 DUAs on day 1 after appropriate medical management can actually come down to a grade 2 or a grade 3 with some amount of limbus remaining. Early and aggressive treatment is a must for these patients, and we need to avoid a corneal perforation under all circumstances. And epithelial cover is there or not. We need to stain these patients again and again. Document, even if you don't have a photo slit lamp or a photography possible on your phone, just document it with good drawings and you will be able to understand how the things are progressing. And let's not wait too long. And amniotic membrane is not the only thing that we can do for these patients, and it should not be a cover for a lack of assessment. We need to understand that there is a judicious use of amniotic membrane that needs to be undertaken, and amniotic membrane is not sadly going to solve all our problems. So thank you for your patient hearing.
Thank you, Devyani. Yeah, a lot of painstaking work, excellent case, excellent documentation, well presented. And I would invite the other corneal surgeons in the audience to give their expert opinion and also ask Devyani about any particular points they might have. Dr. Hemal, Dr. Ramya.
Thank you, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes.
That was an excellent case, Debs. I have just one question. So I know that we always try to avoid a PK in these cases in burns, but this is completely unavoidable. But to take an eccentric graft with a bit of the limbus, a large portion of the limbus attached to one corner, was that deliberate? I mean,
it was.
A bit away from the limbus, away from the blood vessels have helped you a little bit more?
Yeah, so basically the plan was to take a large graft and decided to make it a little eccentric because the perforation also was a little eccentric. There is this rim of superior rim of conjunctival granuloma that I had pointed out. So because that was leading to a lot of inflammation, we actually excised that entire conjunctival granuloma as well. One of the reasons why we had a very bloody surgery. And when we did that, we realized that it is very difficult to assess where the limbus is in these cases because you really don't have too many anatomical landmarks. But so we decided we'll go a little more eccentric because inferiorly there was a rim of cornea that was seen, but superiorly because of the excision of the conjunctival granuloma, we really did not have too much of scleral rim as well. So
yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So
because you wanted to reinforce the area of,
yeah.
So you wanted to basically reinforce the sclera there?
No, there was no scleral thinning per se. Also, another point that I would like to make is that eccentric graft would actually help in cases where probably when you don't have access to tissue glue, when you don't have fibrin glue available and you still want to go ahead and do an alloslet, those are the situations where you may, want to take an eccentric graft on purpose, where, God-given stuck limbus is sitting there. So you need not really, increase the surgical charges for the patient as well. And if you don't have access to it, this is a good way of actually going for it without having to, do a fibrin glue enhanced, because there's no other way. There's no way you can suture an alloslet or
no, you cannot.
Oh yeah, you have to use glue. And if you don't have access to glue at that moment in time, then probably that's a good idea. However, that was not the reason why I did it. But
that's a really inventive reason. I think that's kind of important because
it's a practical
economy
reason.
In these patients also matters because you say they will need a lot of surgeries and you want to save wherever you can. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
that is really the way
yeah.
of thinking.
So yeah, you may need actually multiple surgeries for these patients, which is also a reason why you might want to decrease the cost as much as possible.
Yeah, I also like the fact that you mentioned that AMT is not the panacea because people just tend to do AMTs, but it would be preferable if they did tarsorrhaphies instead and made sure the eye was closed. So that was a good point.
Yeah, thank you.
Excellent case. Thank you.
Thanks for
joining. Devyani. Hello, Devyani. Can I have some something? Nice presentation. Congratulations.
Thank you.
The only thing I would like to ask is that this is a therapeutic graft, right?
Yes.
And so, do you intend to do optical graft for future?
Sir, actually, the next 6 months.
What are the chances of success of that?
So next 6 months, I'm going to look at the eye very closely as far as the epithelial breakdowns is concerned and how the IOP remains. If his IOP remains well in control, sometimes we see that even these large grafts actually tend to do well because they have a larger amount of endothelium available to these patients. So we really don't know. I mean, I'm going to have to do it like a really close look on his IOP for the next 6 months and see if we can do something for him, if his corneal epithelium phenotype remains the same. If not, we may have to do a central PK with a cataract surgery and combine it with a SLET procedure by taking a few stem cells from the other eye. But that is the best case scenario for this patient. I mean, it really depends on the on how the eye behaves from here on forward.
Thank you, Devyani.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Devyani.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. And if we don't have any more comments on that particular cornea case or the surface case, then it is time for me to welcome one of our senior most ophthalmologists of Rajkot, Dr. C.R. Balda, for his case, which says not always it is that simple as you think. And at this point, I have to say that I'm amazed by his enthusiasm. And ever since we announced the case files, he constantly gave me feedback, and he was ready with the case himself. So what more can I ask of such a senior person? Sir, we appreciate your interest and enthusiasm, and we'd like to hear from you what you have to say. Please share your screen and start your.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Purva, for the nice words for me. Actually, this, anyway, I will let you know later on how I came up with this case for presentation. This is a 2020 match, and previous players have already scored 3 centuries. So I am the last batsman. I just defend the wickets and last 5 overs. So I am trying my level best to keep the wickets defended. So this is a case where it is not always as simple as we think. So on the 11th January, that is last month, Sardaben, a patient of 56 years old female, landed at my clinic. She was from Gir Somnath, and she is herself a health worker. This is most important point. Now she had the complaint of left upper lid small nodule since last 6 months, and it was recurrent, and it was drained 3 times and elsewhere, not here, within 6 months. So using refractive error correction for distance and near, no other signs of ocular history of any other surgery or any treatment. No history of any other major systemic illness, medical treatment, or allergies or abuse any drugs. On examination, both eyes visual acuity was 6/12, and the reason was posterior subscleral cataract. Intraocular pressure was 16 millimeter. Upper lid small lesion 3/3 millimeter of size, and both I said earlier senile cataract, but the rest was within normal limits. So this is the picture. You can see this small lesion-like lesion, and you can see the lid margin is thickened. That is number 1. Number 2, the posterior margin of the lid, which should be sharp, it is rounded, and there are blocks in the meibomian glands. So I planned for the incision and drainage under local anesthesia and with due precautions. As soon as I opened up, instead of expecting fluid and meibomian secretion, there was a hard nodule. It was encountered. It was very hard, and I removed it with forceps and scissors. All material whichever I could get it, I removed them all and sent for the histopathological examination. See, one of the dreaded differential diagnosis was in my mind was meibomian gland carcinoma, because recurrence was 3 times. Second thing, age and gender. She was a female, and age was more than 50. See, location, that is the upper lid, and it was a hard nodule fill while during excision. So all these things ring a bell in my mind that might be a case of meibomian gland carcinoma. That's why I sent it for the histopathological examination. And after the excision, I assessed the lymphadenopathy anyway. It was not there, it was negative. So unfortunately, the clinical suspicion was realized when the HP report was received, which I received on 19th. This is histopathological report. If you look at the last line, that histological findings are consistent with clinical diagnosis of the sebaceous carcinoma. Meibomian gland carcinoma is also known as sebaceous carcinoma. So here it gets confirmed whatever suspicion we had clinically. Now these are the histological slides, and there are foamy cells plus detailed view is here. All the nuclei, these are neoplastic cells, centrally located nuclei, and some of the cells show the nucleus is pushed toward the periphery. This is one more enlarged picture. So all confirms our diagnosis, histopathological diagnosis, that it is a case of meibomian carcinoma. Now some data about the meibomian gland carcinoma. It is 1 to 3% of all malignant tumors of the lid. It is common in elderly ladies, more common in Asian countries as compared to the Western countries. Upper lid affected more as compared to the lower lid. About 2/3 cases are upper lid, 1/3 are lower lid. It presents as a firm nodule mimicking lesion. May break open on conjunctival side sometimes if it not taken care in time. It may present as a fungating mass or a papillomatous mass, and may present as a blepharitis, which is not responding to treatment. There is a persistent conjunctivitis also is there, and sometimes it leads to thickening of the conjunctiva, palpebral leisure bulbar, and sometimes there is a conjunctivization of the cornea, and there is meibomitis. So these are the few things which are present and management. So other data, it is highly malignant. This is one of the most important factors. It is fast growing tumor. The way within 6 months it recurred 3 times and spread to regional lymph nodes. When it spread to the regional lymph nodes, it becomes more sinister. It may go systematically, and it may cause the life of the patient. So prognosis is bad in upper lid tumors or more than 1 centimeter size. If the tumor is more than 1 centimeter, it is more sinister. Second thing, if the tumor is the medial side, it is affecting the lacrimal canaliculus, it is more dangerous because it immediately spreads to the orbit, and it may go to the brain also. And so if it is on lateral side, we should rule out that it is not affecting the lacrimal gland. And whenever there is a histopathological slide, you must see that neoplastic cells are there, finely vacuolated, cytoplasm, nucleus centrally placed or slightly displaced toward the periphery. But one most important point is that if the nerves are involved or the vessels are involved or lymphatics are involved, then the prognosis is poor. So management is most importantly early diagnosis and wide surgical excision, keeping 4 millimeter healthy tissue around the lesion, and preferably this should be done under the microscope so that we can exactly find out the extent of the tumor, and we can remove the tumor in toto, so that nothing is remaining outside, so there is no chance of recurrence. So oncoplastic surgeon is the best person to manage these cases. So this is the way. This case was unexpectedly. 1 minute. The disturbances are coming up. So what I wanted to tell you is this thing that our president Mukesh Porwal had written 2 or 3 times on WhatsApp that only a single case is there, So I just came across this case on 11th January, and I contacted him. Should I present this case? He said yes, but I said I don't have the histological reports yet so far. So by the time 19th, the reports came and it was positive. I told him that reports is positive and it is a case of meibomian gland carcinoma, histopathologically and clinically also. Now this case I am presenting because in my 50 years of practice as a clinician, I have never come across of such a case that is a meibomian gland carcinoma. I will be happy if any of the participants or the listeners can tell me if they have come across such cases and how they manage it. So I do intend if the patient comes back. So far, patient has not come back because he is a health worker. She might have found some other advice or some might have gone somewhere else. So this is the whole story, and this is the reason why I presented it over here. So that nobody is there, so I said, let me take a little bit share presenting the case. I thank sincerely Dr. Mukesh Porwal for me all the time encouraging that I must present the case, I must present the case, and I did, and I thank herself for his contribution for making this possible. Now, take-home message of this whole case is the detailed history is a must. That will give you the diagnosis in your undergraduate days. It was said that listen, he or she is telling you the diagnosis. So always take the detailed history. Second is trust your observations and examination findings. Third is have confidence in your knowledge. You should know, you should have your full confidence in your knowledge. Do not miss an opportunity to learn. And last but not least is keep your arsenal sharpened. So thank you very much for the permission for the office bearers in Porwal and Suket allowed me to present my case over here. Thank you for kind hearing.
Thank you, sir. It was a nice case, actually eye-opener. Most of us are taking this as a collision, and so from this onwards, we can think over something else too. It can be a meibomian carcinoma. So again, you told us like that history is important. We have to think of other options too. So we'd like to have comments from audience. Any senior person or anyone wants to comment anything on this? Dr. Jethani, sir.
So, Bala sir can stop sharing, please.
Oh, sure. Okay.
We have heard many times that chalazions are not always simple, and today we have seen from none other than the senior most practicing ophthalmologist of Rajkot, I think. Excellent documentation. And sir, I wanted to ask what made you suspect initially that it is not a simple chalazion?
The main part of the history was important that she had undergone 3 surgeries for the same chalazion, and they came over with the words that we are not satisfied with the 3 surgery results. That's why they came over here. Somebody gave my name and landed at my place. This was the first thing. And second thing, another important, when I opened up, it was very hard, which is not expected in case of chalazion. Mostly as soon as you open, fluid and the abdominal secretions, cheesy material comes out, and you just scoop it out, whatever from the nooks and corner, and then put some antibiotic drop. I prepare a betadine. I put 1 drop of betadine and then close it. So that means gets closed by itself. So this was the reason it was very hard. So I did decide that I must send this for histopathology, and that is the reason I sent it for histopathology. And my intuition, or whatever you say, it was right, and it turned out to be carcinoma.
I'm sure most people would not have sent the specimen for histopathology. You did think of it, and definitely it is. In fact, the literature does say that a large number of or a significant number of chalazions actually harbor meibomian cell carcinoma, which is actually missed most of the time.
The most important thing, it is very aggressive tumor. It is fast growing. If it is treated in time and proper surgical precautions are taken, and it is removed in toto, then there is a chance that the patient will be surviving. It is all chances are there. In this patient also, because there is no, it is not penetrated the tarsal plate. It is not. There are no cystis and the lymphadenopathy in the neck or in the preauricle node anywhere. There is no other signs and symptoms suggesting any secondaries. So this patient has got very good chance of survival. So main thing is the general ophthalmologist is the first person to be contacted by these people. So we should be aware. Of course, incidence is reasonably low, but still we have to be on our guard. And particularly when the patient says that he has undergone 3 surgeries, that itself is a red light that we must think further. Thank you.